Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm testing the Dell Alienware AW3426DW, a much more affordable way to access the very latest RGB stripe QD-OLED ultrawide panel. Earlier in the year, I tested this brand new panel in a couple of high-end 360Hz displays from ASUS and MSI, finding that it actually included quite a few improvements relative to the first gen wave of 34-inch ultrawide OLEDs. But to access this RGB stripe panel, you'd have to fork out $1,000 US or more, putting it firmly into the high-end expensive category. The Alienware AW3426DW introduces a new variant of this 2026 QD-OLED ultrawide panel to the market. It's essentially the same as what we got at the start of the year, so the same pentatandem emissive structure, same RGB striped subpixel layout, and the same improvements to brightness, including 1300 nits peak in HDR content. But instead of the panel operating at 360Hz, it runs up to 280Hz instead. That's the only substantial change, so it's looking like it could be a pretty good option if you didn't need the absolute highest refresh rate. The drop in refresh rate brings with it a drop in the asking price. Dell have set the AW3426DW price at $800 US, which is substantially cheaper than the ASUS PG34W CDN and around $150 less than MSI's 360Hz variant. It's the exact same debut price as its predecessor from last year, the AW3425DW, which is great news for gamers. Dell are offering upgraded panel performance at no additional cost. And the AW3426DW doesn't just pack an upgraded panel. There's new features, including Dolby Vision support for the first time, so while it may not look like it has been significantly overhauled from the outside, this is probably the biggest ultrawide upgrade we've seen from Dell yet. First, I want to discuss the new benefits and improvements you get from this brand new 2026 QD-OLED panel. Like the monitors I reviewed at the start of the year, Samsung Display's upgraded ultrawide panel uses the same format and resolution as its predecessors, 34-inch 3440 by 1440. But the big change is the move away from the triangle RGB subpixel layout to a traditional RGB stripe layout, which Samsung Display call V-Stripe. This significantly improves text rendering quality, as the RGB stripe layout is identical to LCDs and works perfectly with subpixel font rendering that's designed for RGB stripe. You won't see any of the pink-green fringing artifacts that were previously seen on QD-OLED monitors. Text looks fantastic on this new panel, equivalent to LCDs of a similar pixel density. The change in subpixel layout is effectively like an increase in resolution when it comes to text rendering, so browsing the web or using desktop apps is now much nicer on this 1440p class QD-OLED. The screen coding and layer composition has been improved to reduce ambient light reflectivity compared to previous QD-OLEDs as well. This has been a major issue with QD-OLEDs for some time. In brighter environments, this panel type reflects light, which leads to raised blacks that appear grey or even slightly tinted purple. The new ultrawide QD-OLED for 2026 reduces reflected light in these conditions and significantly reduces the purple tint, meaning it handles ambient light the best of any QD-OLED so far. However, the improvements here fall short of fixing this problem entirely. Glossy WOLED panels still handle ambient light noticeably better, with deeper blacks in bright conditions. QD-OLEDs handle direct reflections better, so the panel has less of a mirror-like finish, but I still think WOLED panels look better overall and have deeper blacks in more lighting conditions. Dell don't bother with a marketing label to describe this coating improvement. ASUS use Black Shield film and MSI use Dark Armor film, so if you see those terms used with other monitors, Dell are giving you the exact same experience in terms of coding, just without the fancy name. The other improvement to the coating is an increase in hardness from a 2H to 3H rating. The first generation of QD-OLED ultrawides were relatively easy to scratch, even from trivial contact. The hardness improvement makes it more scratch resistant and easier to clean without having to worry about leaving permanent marks on the surface. The main difference between the original batch of 2026 QD-OLEDs and this second wave of lower cost models is the refresh rate, which has been reduced from 360Hz to 280Hz. Same adaptive sync variable refresh rate capabilities, of course, but the peak refresh rate is 22% lower. Response times are unchanged compared to previous OLEDs, so we're still getting the usual lightning fast speeds that blow LCDs out of the water. With OLEDs, motion clarity is directly tied to refresh rate, so a higher refresh rate model delivers better clarity when the highest refresh rate is used. But if you operate two different OLEDs at the same refresh rate, motion clarity will be identical regardless of what the maximum refresh rate actually is. So for example, if you are running a game at 120 FPS/120 Hz, motion clarity would be the same on both the 280 Hz model and the 360 Hz models. It's only when running games above 280 FPS do the 360 Hz models have an advantage in clarity and smoothness due to the higher refresh rate it offers. This ultimately makes the difference between a 280 and 360 Hz QD-OLED quite small. If you're mostly someone that plays games in the middle part of the refresh rate range, so let's say 100 to 200 Hz, there is no benefit to spending more on 360 Hz. And even if you did play at a high frame rate, the difference between 280Hz and 360Hz is not large. It's a 29% higher refresh rate, so it's marginally clearer and slightly more responsive to use, but we're not talking about a game changer here. Saving a decent amount of money to reduce the refresh rate to 280Hz is a great choice in my opinion, because this is still a very good refresh rate. There are some small implications if you like to use frame generation. At 360Hz with 2x frame gen, your base frame rate can be as high as 180 FPS without tearing. At 280Hz, that maximum base frame rate drops to 140 FPS. Input latency is excellent. I recorded a 0.5 millisecond processing delay, which is very fast and up to standard with modern gaming monitors. The 360Hz models have slightly better input latency overall, as their refresh rate is higher, which lowers the refresh component of lag. You get the same processing delay in the HDR mode, making these displays ideal for responsive HDR gaming. Moving now into the HDR section, and of course OLEDs are a great choice for HDR, as many people will already know. The main strengths to this panel type are individual pixel control and zero-level blacks, which create high levels of local contrast. With such fine control over the image, OLEDs can display amazing contrast, even if a bright and dark area are right next to each other. Combined with rapid response times and low input lag, OLEDs keep up with the demands of fast-paced HDR gaming without introducing artifacts or delay. The main weakness to OLED for HDR is overall brightness, especially in brighter, high APL scenes. The AW3426DW produces very similar HDR performance to the 360Hz QD-OLEDs I tested previously, and includes very similar HDR configuration options. Broadly speaking, there's the usual True Black and Peak Brightness modes available to choose from, labeled Display HDR True Black and HDR Peak 1300 respectively. Dell also offer a few other options, most of which perform like the True Black mode. The exception is the HDR Peak 1300 Bright mode, which is a boosted brightness configuration. The Display HDR True Black mode performs the same as other QD-OLED True Black modes. It caps brightness to 530 nits, but otherwise offers an accurate experience, no panel dimming, and strong performance across various test scenarios, whether it's brighter content or darker content. The Peak 1300 mode raises the brightness ceiling to 1300 nits, which is achievable in dark content with small highlights. This mode is very accurate in dark scenes and produces excellent color results with perfect saturation. However, in bright scenes, panel dimming is a problem. In some circumstances, brightness is halved across the entire scene compared to what it should be. This is the major trade-off you get when unlocking the full peak brightness capabilities of the panel, and it's a flaw seen with every QD-OLED panel so far. This is why Dell also offer the Peak 1300 Bright mode, which combats panel dimming at the expense of raising brightness in dark scenes beyond what is accurate. Unfortunately, this means that once again we're in a position where there is no single perfect HDR mode available on this monitor. Ultimately, you'll have to make a choice between better overall HDR accuracy provided by the True Black mode, or higher peak brightness with panel dimming in the Peak mode. I personally prefer the way the Peak modes look in general, but ideally this issue would have been fixed by now. When I compare the accuracy of the HDR modes to other monitors, this Dell display performs well. Dark scene accuracy is very strong in both the True Black and Peak configurations, though this is no different to the 360Hz models. Bright scene accuracy is pretty good in the True Black mode, but poor in the Peak mode. Color match results are strong though, better than what I saw with the AW3425DW last year. This is a wide gamut monitor with 98% coverage of DCI-P3 and 77.5% coverage of Rec 2020. That's very much in line with the other 2026 QD-OLED Ultrawides, so there's been no downgrade in color performance here. However, color space coverage is slightly reduced compared to the AW3425DW, which uses the second gen ultrawide panel at 240Hz. Color volume is excellent though, with an MDC of 22, which is slightly higher than the 25DW and in line with the other 2026 ultrawides. In synthetic brightness tests, the AW3426DW delivers the same performance as other 2026 QD-OLED ultrawides. Full screen brightness hits up to 330 nits, 10% window brightness is about 540 nits, and 2% window brightness hit 1330 nits on my unit. This is ever so slightly brighter than the other models I've tested. Real scene brightness is again as expected, which is good because it confirms that no part of this panel's brightness performance has been downgraded relative to the 360Hz panels. The peak 1300 mode has strong brightness in low APL content exceeding 1100 nits, though panel dimming hurts high APL scenes. The true black mode is more consistent but has an overall low level of brightness. In addition to being similar to the 360Hz models, the AW3426DW provides a nice brightness increase over the previous gen AW3425DW. In some tests, brightness was nearly 30% higher, though other results were similar, so on average, brightness has only increased by 8%. Still, the new model is generally brighter and more accurate in the HDR mode, which is a nice win overall. The 26DW is the first QD-OLED ultrawide from Dell to offer Dolby Vision support. This is actually something the 360Hz models from Asus and MSI don't offer, so it's a nice inclusion that Dell are providing, despite the lower cost of their variant. The way Dolby Vision works in Windows these days is a bit different to the early days of this feature. Previously, if you had Dolby Vision enabled, it would always be used, even if you were displaying regular HDR10 content. This would mean HDR10 content would get mapped to Dolby Vision, and often this would hurt performance and brightness. However, that's not how it works as of mid-2026. Now, with Dolby Vision enabled, Windows will automatically switch to the HDR10 mode whenever HDR10 content is being played. The screen briefly flicks to black as it switches out of the Dolby Vision mode and into the HDR10 mode. This is a much better way of operating because it ensures the correct monitor mode is being used. If you find the mode switching annoying, you can disable Dolby Vision in the OSD, which will then always use HDR10. For PC users, Dolby Vision is not especially useful, as most content does not support or use Dolby Vision. There are some Dolby Vision enabled games, but very few, and none of them are recent. Clearly the ecosystem there needs work. However, you might find that some streaming services will use Dolby Vision for video playback. Dolby Vision support is much more relevant if you plan on hooking up a media player to this monitor, as dedicated media players often have much better Dolby Vision support than you'd see on PC. The downside to Dolby Vision mode is that it only offers the brightness capabilities of the Display HDR True Black mode, so brightness is limited to just over 500 nits. In some cases, you might prefer disabling Dolby Vision anyway, forcing content into the HDR10 Peak 1300 mode to achieve higher brightness. However, the true black nature of the Dolby Vision mode actually provides an advantage on PC with the new mode switching capabilities of Windows. The Dolby Vision mode is brighter and looks better for tone-mapped desktop apps than the HDR10 Peak 1300 mode. With Dolby Vision enabled, you get this nice auto-switching system where the desktop benefits from true black type performance, while HDR10 content gets the full Peak 1300 experience. I should note here that not all content automatically mode switches. For example, watching an HDR YouTube video in Chrome will stay in the Dolby Vision mode, even though the content is actually HDR10. But from what I've seen, most games do mode switch, so it might require a bit of messing around to see what works the best. In the SDR mode, performance is reasonable out of the box. Dark grey gamma is a bit elevated, so content is a bit too contrasty, but otherwise, grayscale results are good and the color temperature is decent. There's the usual concerns with oversaturation for SDR content, as no Rec 709 gamut emulation is used by default. With this panel having such a wide color gamut, this means skin tones are redder than they should be, as one example. However, there are several configurations that can be used to improve SDR performance. One is Windows Auto Color Management, which eliminates oversaturation and leads to better color accuracy, with a color checker delta E average of 5.9. The other is using the built-in sRGB mode, which is less flexible than using ACM, as it locks most settings and leaves you unable to adjust white balance. With that said, Dell have done a fantastic job of calibrating the sRGB mode, so not having access to some settings is not that relevant. White balance and gamma are magnificent, leading to a very low grayscale delta E. Saturation and color checker results are also amazing, with an extremely low delta E. So this is one of the most accurate sRGB modes I've seen. It's therefore no surprise that in sRGB mode charts, the AW3426DW performs extremely well. It tops the grayscale chart, beating the 360Hz variants I've tested, and it outperforms the previous generation model. Color checker results are extremely good as well, keeping Dell as one of the leading candidates for color accuracy in the SDR mode. Full screen SDR brightness is good for an OLED, coming in at 313 nits, again very similar to the 360Hz models, showing no downgraded capabilities. This isn't at the level of LCDs, but is highly usable in most situations. There's a healthy 27% increase in SDR brightness for the 26DW model compared to the previous Gen 25DW model. Minimum brightness is very good at 22 nits. There's no concerns here with viewing angles or panel uniformity. Unlike WOLED panels, QD-OLEDs offer excellent uniformity with no dark grey banding or dirty screen effect. My unit was very consistent from edge to edge. The power consumption of the AW3426DW fits right between the 25DW and the new 360Hz models. There's nothing out of the ordinary here, that's what I'd expect for a monitor of this size and refresh rate. In mid-APL gaming, power consumption is very reasonable and again, as expected. Dell have packed in several features to the OSD, which is controlled through a directional toggle on the bottom edge of the display. There's several preset modes and color controls, a dark stabilizer, picture-in-picture mode, DSC toggle, and RGB LED lighting controls. Most of Dell's gaming features are found within the Vision mode, which allows you to add crosshairs onto the screen and apply some color filters to a defined area. Another addition to the feature set is the eSports mode, which is fairly straightforward. This mode emulates a 25-inch screen size with a resolution of 2368 by 1332. It looks good because it uses 1:1 pixel mapping and it retains capabilities like the 280Hz refresh rate and HDR support. Unfortunately, Dell's OLED care settings are non-existent. OLED panels are susceptible to permanent burn-in, so they're not a great choice for continual static content, like using desktop apps for long periods. Dell have implemented OLED care features that will slightly shift the screen and dim it in certain scenarios. You just can't control those features at all. They're always enabled. In better news, Dell still offer their 3-year burn-in warranty. The AW3426DW uses a design that is virtually identical to the previous model. It's Dell's AW30 design with a deep blue finish the company calls Interstellar Indigo. I think this color looks great. However, if you were expecting a normal neutral black, this is not a standard black, but a dark design with a blue tint. The rear of the display is a single sleek panel that looks excellent. It's a relatively slim design with fantastic build quality, befitting a high-end product, thanks to the use of a high-quality plastic outer shell. There's a rounded stand pillar with a cable management hole, and the base is a small square that doesn't use up too much desk space and allows you to put items on top of it. The stand has acceptable strength to resist wobble and supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustment. The maximum level of height on offer is pretty good. The port selection is also unchanged from the AW3425DW. There's one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 48GB/s ports, and a 2-port USB 5GB/s hub with a Type A and Type C connector. The placement of these USB ports is great as they're along the bottom edge, which is easily accessible, rather than tucked away with the other ports on the rear. The Type C only supports data and 15 watts of power delivery. It can't be used as a display input. There's no KVM switch here. Overall, the Dell Alienware AW3426DW is the biggest upgrade to Dell's flagship 34-inch ultrawide since the introduction of the original QD-OLED model back in 2022. This is all thanks to the new upgraded 280Hz panel, which packs in all the latest 2026 technology that we first saw at the start of the year. And despite including all these improvements, Dell have not increased the launch price whatsoever. The new panel used in the 26DW is a significant upgrade because it's essentially a 4-year jump in technology. The subpixel layout has been upgraded from triangle RGB to a proper RGB stripe, noticeably improving text quality on this 3440 by 1440 display. The screen coating and layer composition has been improved to reduce ambient light reflectivity, providing somewhat deeper blacks in bright ambient environments, and it increases the screen's hardness. And then we get a brightness improvement on top of that. SDR brightness has increased from 250 nits to over 300 nits. HDR brightness improves from display HDR True Black 400 tier to True Black 500 tier, offering better brightness at most window sizes. Peak brightness now hits 1300 nits, up from 1000 nits. And to cap it all off, the refresh rate is slightly higher as well, at 280 Hz. The good news is that all of these new technologies have been integrated without really sacrificing anything. The AW3426DW is actually even better calibrated than its predecessor, with an outstanding sRGB mode and very good HDR EOTF tracking. Yes, panel dimming is still an issue like with every QD-OLED release to date, but Dell offer a range of HDR modes you can choose from, including Dolby Vision for the first time. If this is your first OLED gaming monitor, you're in for a treat. Motion performance is fantastic thanks to fast response times and a high 280Hz refresh rate. The contrast ratio is immaculate thanks to deep zero-level blacks and decent brightness. HDR gaming looks fantastic as the OLED panel is capable of fast per-pixel control, and the 34-inch ultrawide format continues to be a great choice for additional immersion in games relative to standard 27-inch monitors. The best part about the AW3426DW is that it essentially performs the same as the flagship 360Hz ultrawide models I tested at the start of the year. The QD-OLED panel is from the same 2026 family, and the only thing that's been cut back relative to the 360Hz models is the refresh rate. Even then, 280Hz is pretty close to 360Hz, it's not a significant downgrade. At a price tag of $800 US, the AW3426DW is the go-to choice for 34-inch QD-OLED ultrawide gaming in 2026. I see little reason to spend more on the 360Hz models, which are typically at least $150 more expensive, because the only advantage you get is a slightly higher refresh rate. I'd just save the money and get the 280Hz model, it offers a great experience. The only reason you choose the 360Hz models now is if you always play games at very high frame rates, or if you want some of the features offered on the flagship Asus and MSI models. But for most gamers that don't regularly exceed 280 FPS, that extra refresh rate will be of no benefit, and there aren't many killer features that otherwise make the 360Hz models worth recommending. In short, I highly recommend the Alienware AW3426DW. I continue to be very impressed with Dell's ultrawide OLED lineup, and I'm glad to see significant improvements at the same price point. There are, of course, a few other 34-inch 280Hz QD-OLED monitors that are launching shortly, which I might get to testing as well, but for now, the AW3426DW is a great product that gets my tick of approval. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you are interested in purchasing the AW3426DW based on this review, or maybe one of the other monitors that I talk about, we do have links to those in the description below, so check those out down there. Also down there, we have a link to our Patreon account. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, like our monthly live streams. We've got our Discord community. We also have the calibrated settings and ICC profiles for the monitors that we test, so you get all of that if you're a member of our Patreon, and you end up supporting Monitors Unboxed and all the testing that we do. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.